I'm Caroline Hill. I'm Editor-in-Chief of Legal IT Insider, and welcome to Latera TV. It's Pride Month, and today on Latera TV, we're putting the legal sector under the microscope in terms of how it's really supporting the LGBT community, with a particular focus on supporting transgender employees who are still very often subject to prejudice and a lack of understanding that can seriously hamper their careers. And I'm extremely grateful to be joined by three guests who are here to help me unpick the continuing challenges as well as some of the progress that's being made by the legal sector. So we've got David Aird, who's IT Director at DAC Beechcroft and Executive LGBT Champion for DAC.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, David.
Nice to see you, Caroline. Nice to see you guys.
Nice to see you. I've got Amanda Hilton, who's a Senior Chartered Legal Executive at DAC Beechcroft and Vice Chair of Spectrum. And Amanda writes a blog called Amanda Hilton, Being the Real Me, that recently notched up to 20,000 page views. Hi, Amanda.
Hi.
That's a good milestone there.
The infamous Amanda G. Hilton, I think.
And Luke Williams, who's Vice Chair of the Law Society's LGBT Lawyers Division Committee and part of the Trans and Non-Binary Inclusion Project team. Hi, welcome, Luke. Nice to see you.
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me. Before we dive into the weeds, I'd be really grateful if you would tell me and everyone listening in a little bit more about yourself, including how you came out in the workplace and what pronoun you use. And I don't mind who starts. Maybe start with the order I introduced you in, so David.
Hi guys, I'm David Aird. My pronouns are he, him, and I am a cisgender male, so I'm not a trans male. And we might touch on some of these points later. My coming out story, I came out when I was, I think, 23, 24, something like that. I came out to friends, and then, like a lot of people, I was already in a workplace, so it was a bit uncomfortable to sort of, be one thing one minute. And I certainly wasn't pretending to be straight or have girlfriends, but as I read an article today, I was sort of, over out the weekend with friends, not pretty non-descriptive. And it was only sort of when I met my now husband of 22 years we've been together, that I started, and when I left that company, I started to be, more open with people. My journey's been really good. I've had very, very few, and nothing directed at me with regards to homophobia or any anti-LGBT sentiments. A few comments here and there. Earlier on in my career, I sort of let them drift and didn't feel confident enough. But certainly nowadays, and for the last probably 10, 15 years, I sort of, challenge them if I hear them. But it's very rare, and tends to be the odd a daft joke or something, and they don't realise that you're a gay person or whatever the joke's about. So that's my story. But in general, very positive. And I think I came around just after what the 80s and with regards to sexual maturity and things. So I missed a lot of that, the AIDS fever and all, fervour and all the rest of it. So I think I was quite lucky to be sort of, if I'd been 5-10 years older, I think it would have been a lot worse. So yeah, very positive tale from me.
It's good to hear. Thank you, Amanda.
Hi, yeah, Amanda Hilton, as has been said, Senior Chartered Legal Exec at DAC, been here 16 years and in private practice 25 years. Feel free to say I don't look old enough. Thank you very much. I say that every time and it works. Thank you.
The chocolates in the post.
I only came out 3 to 4 years ago, I think it was, and started transitioning 18 months ago, both socially and medically. So my story is relatively new. It took me a very, very long time to consider and come to terms with who I was, and I just put up with being who I wasn't, mainly because of societal pressures. Growing up in the 70s and the 80s, not a particular nice era for the LGBT community and certainly for trans people. But changing personal circumstances made me think twice about it. And decided that going forward, I had to be true to myself.
That's great. Thank you. And Luke?
Thank you. I think to some extent, my experiences of transition have been sort of a bit of a mixed bag. So I actually got my training contract with my sort of training firm before I realised I was trans, which then meant that I kind of had to transition semi-publicly sort of in the workplace. And I mean, this was about 7 years ago now that, I was kind of starting that training contract. And I think to some extent, my firm perhaps wasn't as aware of the need to bring your whole self to work and the importance of that as an inseparable part of who you are as a lawyer that maybe firms are today. So whilst the lawyers on the ground were great, sometimes getting through to HR, sort of what it was that I needed from them to support me as an employee was a little bit more tricky. But yeah, as I say, it was really helpful to some extent to have that safe work environment where I could come to work and be myself in circumstances where, I was still awaiting sort of a diagnosis and treatment from the gender clinic. So outside of work, being misgendered, sort of being mistaken for a butch lesbian, all of those sorts of things that were pretty much day-to-day occurrences. At least I had the peace of mind of knowing that when I went to my pretty stressful workplace, by virtue of the job, I didn't have to worry about all of that stuff on top as well. So yeah, transition sort of fine without incident at my training firm, qualified, left upon qualification and kind of did a bit of time freelancing as a tutor, and then have sort of worked in legal education since then, really. Couple of sort of negative incidents as a freelancer. I think mainly a product of kind of misplaced curiosity, not helped by the fact that my then girlfriend and I were working in the same place. So there would be colleagues of both of us who would kind of ask her inappropriate questions, specifically because they knew they shouldn't be asking them of me. But again, I'd moved on from that place. And then the interesting thing I think for me has been that sort of one of the byproducts of being somebody as a trans man who fits neatly within those two boxes that society provides of sort of men and women, is that people make all sorts of assumptions, a bit like David was saying, about what gay or bi or trans people look like. And, I've heard sort of negative comments about trans people before that have been made because people didn't know that I was one. But the really heartening thing about my current workplace is that when somebody made such a comment at like an induction sort of meeting, immediately another colleague stepped in and said, like, that's not acceptable. And, I'd only known her probably about half an hour by this point. So the fact that there are still allies out there willing to sort of call stuff out demonstrates that, I think, as I say, it really is just a product of luck of the draw sometimes as to how your experiences go.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm going to come on to talk a bit about allies a bit later. So it's really good that you bring that up. So thank you. So this conversation, when I was thinking about what meaningful conversations we could have, so as I said, Laterra is running an entire day of conversations for Pride Month. David said that really we should focus. We're going to talk about LGBT in the realm within the legal sector. But it seems to me that, and David's pointed this out, that and law firms are very proud of their LGBT status. We're promoting it, etc. But to be honest with you, they seem to have got themselves a bit more together when it comes to LGBT, but not trans. Is that a fair assessment? To me, it seems like, and I know you don't necessarily have to speak personally about the firm that you're working in, but I'm just talking about in the round. It seems that law firms really haven't got their act together. Is that fair to say? To anybody, really? David, actually.
Well, I start on this. I would put it more general first of all.
Okay.
Without putting the firms under the spotlight. And I suggested this because, and Amanda and I have talked to this a few times. I feel we're with trans people, and obviously I'm not trans myself, but got two trans colleagues and friends here. I think trans people today are like gay people were in the 80s when you had EastBenders as the headline in the Sun newspaper, with the, as he's now some, is it Lord Cashman, in the House of Lords, the EastEnders actor, because two guys were kissing on EastEnders. They would never think, you could never get away with writing that in the press now, but people can write whatever they want at the moment still about trans people. It is that, to me, I think last bastion, and it sounds like, two colleagues have had somewhat more favourable times, but I still think personally I'm seeing quite a lot of hatred, quite frankly, and vitriol against the trans community. I think it's the whole LGBT, the whole spectrum of sexuality and how people think they are and perceive themselves to be is under the microscope, and it's all been, most of the tension, I think, is at the trans side of things, and then also you get, non-binary people and things that are thrown in as well. But I personally, as a slight outsider, but part of this community, feel that, and I suppose, from a law firm's perspective, if there's whatever percentage of people that are LGBT or lesbian or gay in the firm, how many people are trans? Probably even less still. So there's a bit of a numbers game here. So there's, it's not every day that someone comes to HR or IT to change a name or to transition. So I think through no fault of your own, you find that firms and companies in general sometimes don't have the processes behind them when these sort of things, and to a certain extent that was the case with us, and Amanda, you might want to share your experience with us, and not to say hopefully it was a bad experience, but we had to sort of think up things from scratch, to be honest.
Yeah, Amanda, I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I'm aware, and I think David will confirm this, I was the first person in DAC to socially transition whilst being an employee, and that was, I think I first approached David as he was the head of Spectrum at the time. Must be over 3 years ago now. And it was all very cloak and dagger, which, I really had no expectation or anticipation of how the firm would deal with it. I knew Spectrum existed.
Which is an LGBT group, by the way.
Yeah, LGBT group. Yep, sorry, terminology. Yeah, I knew they existed, but I didn't know whether there was. I was certainly in Manchester office where I work. There was no indication that we had anyone who was transgender. I hadn't read about anything on various websites and what have you in the firm that there was anyone transgender. So I was incredibly nervous, and I've been open about it. I was seriously thinking, is this the firm for me to do what I'm about to do? And it was only when, as David said, when we worked through it together, that we got there, I think. And some people say you're a trailblazer. I don't see it that way. I'm just trying to be me. But in some respects, yes, I was, because I was the first to do it. But it was an approach, because there was no one had done it before. We did have to do. It was a bit, in the dark. Do we do this? Do we do that? Are we getting this right? But by doing it and working together, we got there pretty seamlessly. I think I would hope. There were maybe a few minor hiccups along the way, but generally speaking, people who I confided in kept my confidence, both friends and professionally, in managers, etc. And it was left to me to deal with the timescale, the timetable, how I wanted to do it, how I wanted to tell, firstly, people locally, and then people nationally and even internationally. So yeah, it was a good learning experience, I think, for the firm as well as for me.
Yeah, and I think coincidentally at the time, just to round it off, we on Spectrum, and Amanda wasn't a member at that time, had been talking about trans issues and saying we really need to get on top of this, this trans thing, if you like, and make sure that we're open and supportive and seen that way. But, you've got a lot of other letters there. You've got a lot of people that, BAME people that are LGBT and things. So we're running around doing lots of things. And the trans thing, until Amanda started to come out, was sort of on a list somewhere, but not top of the list. So we, of course, and to a certain extent, that's probably 4 or 5 years ago now, 3-4 years ago. So I would hope other firms can take our learnings and things, but we certainly were not perfect, but we're in a lot better position now. Look, I don't know what your experience have been in your different firms and things.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd echo your initial comments in terms of it's not so much that law firms are kind of letting the side down or, they're objectively failing. I think it's more a product of the fact that societally, leaving aside all of the vitriol and stuff in the press that you alluded to, I think sexuality is kind of easy for people to understand because, if you have a straight man who loves his wife, then he can kind of say, okay, I can understand how a gay man might love his husband like I love my wife. But I think whilst it's entirely proper from my perspective that the T be part of the LGBT plus acronym, because of our shared history and struggle and whatnot, I think that trans people are still seen as something of a mystery, and particularly non-binary people, where if you take a trans man like me, it's very easy to apply the kind of born in the wrong body narrative and say, oh, he was born a girl, but he's a man, and you're crossing over from A to B. But for non-binary people who don't neatly put their gender into like one of two boxes like that, I think it's harder for people to conceptualize. And I think to some extent this touches on something about terminology that we may or may not get into later. I guess what it really boils down to is it doesn't really matter whether intellectually, philosophically, whatever you understand it. Ultimately, what this all boils down to, particularly from HR perspectives, is to treat people as people and to kind of say to them, right, what is it you need to bring your whole self to work? How can we facilitate that? Yeah. Because that's the way we're going to get the best out of you. And I think that's, as I say, that's not that law firms are failing to do the minimum. There is certainly more that can be done. But I think that's because as a society, we still don't really understand trans people.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And I would say, Amanda, and both, you think you are trailblazers, and I'd be curious. So you've obviously, and I think David's point about people have got something to learn from you is a really good one. And I'd be curious to know what that is in terms of what do law firms do? So obviously firms have been caught on the hop, but I would sort of suggest that perhaps going forward there's less excuse for that to happen, right? Like as time goes on and hopefully as we have more of these conversations, there's less excuse. But perhaps we could make this instructive in terms of, what do you feel that law firms and corporates need to do today? I'm going to divide the question into two. So because I think that there's immediate steps that firms and corporates, perhaps we should focus on firms as a group, but what they should do today, and from your learnings? I'd be really curious, and then perhaps we can look at a bit longer term. But what would you say, from the experiences you've had, that law firms listening in need to do right now in terms of sort of paving the way for other people going through the same experience?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, when I came out, I decided to take a sort of evangelical approach to it, in that, as well as this is me, this is how I'm going to be, this is what I'm going to do, I also took the view that, well, it's about time you started learning about us. So we did, pre-COVID, we did a tour around the offices where I did talks in person in front of people and basically told my story. And what was interesting was that pretty much at every location I went to in the UK, someone had come up to me at the end and say, oh, this is my experience. Either they've got a friend or a member of the family, or they know someone. And it was amazing how many people had that connection to the trans community, but how to, speak to someone about it, or, where to go about it. In some cases it was obviously close family, other cases it was distant family. And by me coming out and me existing, there was that conduit for people to say, oh, well, we've got someone who might know about this. I even got asked to advise legally for a client via a partner in another office. They wanted my input on what they thought they were doing for their client in terms of trans policies. So it was quite interesting that when I actually did come out, that educational need was obvious. And I think in the very short term, it is about that. I'm more than happy, and I say on my LinkedIn page, if you want to hear my story, I'll gladly tell it. Because I think it's all about education, and that stops this misconception or this misunderstanding about what trans people are.
But presumably that's a really interesting point, and I was watching a TED talk about this. And it's great that you've got the energy and desire to talk about it. But equally, there must surely be an obligation on the firm to start sharing that information, so it doesn't all fall to you. Because I think from TED talks and other talks I've listened to, people get really bored of having to say the same things again and again. And actually, you've got your own job and your own stuff to do. And so I suppose whilst you want to talk about it, at the same place, I guess there's an obligation on the firm to sort of create, however they, perhaps through Spectrum, or have an actual pool, some obvious place where people can go and educate themselves as well, right?
I'll pick up on that a little bit, and then maybe Luke wants to come in. As we know, I work in IT, this about being, ex-chair of Spectrum and all that, so very supportive of all these things, particularly as a gay man myself. I think things like a transitioning at work policy, writing trans things into your HR policies, they can contact Amanda and I after this, video, and we'll send them ours. Law firms particularly are great at sharing stuff. That's not going to give any of us a competitive edge. We'll share that. They can contact Stonewall. You can download these things. You could have that by tomorrow afternoon. You can have these sort of things set up. I think, also hints and tips I would give out are people like HR and IT teams who are involved with the change of names, the setup of people's accounts. People change their names because they're getting married all the time or divorced and things. But someone, changing from one name, which is a hugely important thing for trans people to move from their old name to the name they feel they should always have had. It's a hugely personal thing. So when you get that wrong because process or someone at the service says it's probably the first time in their entire life they've had this, and suddenly think, well, hold on, this must be a mistake because the person's this and it's changed, so naturally they don't think, but either helping with that process along the way, which is what we did, and also teaching them that actually this is probably going to happen more and more often. People want to be who they are, so just be aware of these things and be sensitive to those issues, rather than saying, oh, hi, I think there's a mistake here, this person's changing from a male name, so to speak, to a female name, or vice versa.
And I guess that comes down to a bit of education as well, probably. Yeah. In terms of, and Luke, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just to kind of round off the point that you made earlier about the idea of the same people sort of having to tell their story time and again, before I then sort of give you some steps that firms can take. I think that is true, but to some extent, it's something that I in particular find myself happy to do by virtue of the fact that I would much rather that trans people be consulted on policies and things that affect us than that somebody well-meaning does something which actually could sort of have detrimental effects to trans people later down the line. So, for instance, if you write what you think is an ideal trans policy, and actually it doesn't cover non-binary or gender fluid people, then it's not an ideal policy because that is very much part of our community. But I mean, one way of kind of offsetting that and recognizing that what you're asking for is our expertise and our lived experience, which clearly has value, or you wouldn't be coming to us, is to make sure that if you are kind of getting external speakers or consultants in, that you pay them for their expertise, or at the very least offer to make a donation to a charity of their choice, which is something that sort of previously hadn't occurred to me. As I say, I see this very much as my pro bono, but I did like a roundtable for some partners of a firm once because they had an employee who was kind of transitioning, and the fact that they made the offer, I think really helped to show that it was very much going to be a good faith discussion, and that they valued my input, and therefore, because they were making that contribution, we're going to take it forward. But I mean, in terms of things that firms can do, in terms of short term, these are very often called quick wins. But I hasten to add that they should not be seen as little ticks in the box to get you on the Workplace Equality Index that you can then sort of jettison. But things like marking LGBT History Month, or specific days like Bi Visibility Day, Trans Day of Visibility, encouraging people, if they want to put their pronouns in their email signatures with an explanation of sort of why that's important. I use he, him pronouns, so does David. You might make that assumption for us based on our appearance, but we shouldn't be judging people on appearance, and it's important that it shouldn't be mandatory, because otherwise you force people to out themselves before they're ready. But again, it signals to clients in particular that you're up on these things, and that you're an approachable person who's not going to be transphobic if they come out to you. So another thing that firms can do, I think, is a starting point, if they really feel completely at sea and they don't have all these policies and things that David and Amanda are talking about, is the Law Society, as the sort of professional body for solicitors, like the sort of professional association, has put together a transition and change to gender expression template. And to complement that, we've got a manager's guide, an HR guide, and also a pronoun policy. I hasten to add these are very much a starting point, so they would need to be kind of tailored to be implemented as the firm saw fit for its own context. But those are on the Law Society website, and Caroline, I can give you a link to those if that'd be helpful to kind of upload. But those are kind of starting points to get you going. I think more generally, for me, one of my main sources of sort of ongoing stress, if you like, is the fact that trans healthcare is woefully inadequate in the UK. So generally speaking, if you have some problem, say with your knee, that's going to need you to see a specialist, the NHS Constitution says that you should be seen by a specialist within 18 weeks. That's like 4.5 months. For some of the gender clinics, the waiting time for a first appointment, and that's just the first appointment. It's not for hormones, it's not for surgery, not for anything substantial. At some of the gender clinics, it's literally a 4.5-year wait. And the cost of surgery, particularly transmasculine surgery, is prohibitively expensive. It's not something that you can self-fund. So having a think about your private medical and what benefits you get, and whether the scope for including gender confirmation surgery is part of that, that would obviously be helpful. I mean, in my current workplace, I think there's coverage for a couple of £1,000 maybe of counselling for gender dysphoria, but I did the maths, and it broke down to about 2 years worth of appointments, and that doesn't actually help you get any further forward on the waiting list if it only covers 2 years of counselling when you're on a 4-year list. Personally, I'd much rather have been able to say, look, I've got the diagnosis, I want to put that money towards surgery, but that's not how it works. So that's something. I guess the only other thing that sort of comes to mind is just acknowledging where it's possible for you to sort of lighten the load. So flexibility around use of sick leave. Very often we have to save that for a rainy day for surgery. There's no scope really for negotiating the date. You take it or leave it. Acknowledgement of possibly the need for special leave, that kind of thing, and really sort of additional support on just a human level. Acknowledging there's an interesting phenomenon that psychologists have kind of been studying called minority stress, where basically different minority strands have higher baseline stress levels than people who don't have those protected characteristics, just because they've got the daily sort of vitriol and sort of stigma and prejudice to contend with mentally, as well as their other stresses. So I think acknowledging the need for mental health support and compassion and manager understanding is also something that businesses can do to help with that.
That's great. Yeah. And I will find a way to allow people to reach out to you. There's plenty of people that you can go to in terms of law firms if you want, and so you've got Stonewall, and that's really helpful. All of those references, there's plenty of places to start. That feels to me, I said I'd divide it into short and long term. That kind of feels like we might have covered both. Is there any things these feel to me like something that, in terms of the policies and looking at the policies, and there's plenty of resources in terms of what they ought to include in terms of the types of things that you've all outlined. Is there anything else, long down the line that law firms need to think about, or do you think we've covered a lot of it?
I would say just from picking up some of Luke's comments, I think that the insurance point is more a longer term thing, but I think it is something we all have to look at. It's probably not something that we can magic one tomorrow, and whilst the operations, as Luke said, are expensive, on the other hand, there's not that many people needing them. So in actual fact, when you look at the analysis behind what the increase to insurance policies would be, or health insurance policies, I don't think it's that much. But of course, everyone's worried about the bottom line and things. But I think that's something that more and more firms and companies outside of legal need to have a look at. And just picking up one tiny point about you were saying about having to wanting to chat about this and educate. I think for probably the three of us, and I think some people don't think about this. Often we're coming out every day. Every time I have a supplier meeting for the first time, they'll say, quite naturally, because 94% of people of my age are married with a wife and 3 kids. So oh, what are you doing the weekend? Oh, I'm out with it. All right, okay, you out with a wife or something? Like, I have to say, oh no, I've got a husband. We're doing this. We're doing that. And even doing that just sometimes feels jarring. So you almost, at first it feels like you're making a point and a political point, and in actual fact you're not. But it does take a tiny bit of energy, and then sometimes they're a little bit, oh, I didn't mean it in a bad way, or I'm like, no, not at all. And it's if your lived experience is the fact that most people are straight, of course you're going to assume most people are straight, but it's just occasionally, so I think for all of us, we probably have to talk about these things at least a few times a week, whether we want to or not.
Yeah, and hopefully, as I said, the more conversations, the less people will assume, but I think again, it comes down to a bit of an education and sort of awareness, not campaign, but more conversations. In terms of, I wanted to talk briefly. Oh, Joe, I'm loving this conversation. We might run on a bit long, but so, if that's all right with you guys. So, in terms of advising individuals who, like allies, so you mentioned it about how important it is to have people in the workplace who might be there in a very informal way, sort of helping pick people up on their language, or. But I've been reading a little bit about this, and I think sometimes people who have the willingness to be allies, sometimes they don't, it's still very early days, they don't know where to start. So what would you advise? Obviously they need to find out the facts, they perhaps need to engage with the leadership, and perhaps they are in a position to call out for more inclusive policies as well. Is that fair? Is there anything else that you might add to that?
Maybe start with Luke this time. I've started the last couple. Put you in the spot, Luke.
Oh, no, that's fine. I'll take it. I think it's a difficult balancing act, because to some extent it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about the importance of trans people speaking for themselves. Yes. But certainly there's a role for allies to sort of call out, inappropriate behaviour and to amplify trans voices. So if, for instance, you're not aware of any trans people in your workplace, certainly it's better for an ally to sort of be saying, well, we don't seem to have a policy for this, and we don't know, it's not acceptable for HR to say, oh, well, there are no trans people here, we don't need one, because it may actually be that there's somebody closeted who doesn't feel able to say anything because they think that the firm is not going to get it. So I think certainly there is a role for allies to play in terms of accountability. But at the same time, if trans people are kind of saying, here is an issue, here is the problem, the last thing that we need is kind of allies saying, oh, I'm sure it meant that whoever it was meant well, because again, that kind of mitigates the hurt that we're trying to express. And I think, just kind of being mindful of trans voices, but at the same time trying to sort of amplify them and ensure that trans rights and equality is kind of on the agenda is quite a difficult balance for allies to strike sometimes, but ultimately where they add the most value.
Okay. I don't know, Amanda, if you did want to add.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, the strongest allies for me have been individual friends, managers, and even, Virginia Clegg, our senior partner, came up to see me just to have a chat. And that to me was amazing. I've worked in places where the senior partner hasn't got a clue who you are, never mind what you're up to, and the fact that she took time out when she was up here just to sit down and have a chat, and it's that sort of approach that we'll support you, we will shout from the rooftops when necessary, and we will work around what you need. It made the whole process that much more smoother.
And I think it's a danger, just to pick up on Luke's point, is that we all have lives. In Beechcroft now we have one of our slogans is a life that works. Your personal life doesn't stop at the front door. When you get into the office and vice versa. And this is why it's so important people bring them real selves to work. But also when Amanda did her chats in our Bristol office, I had a straight lad who works in our finance team asked to come, and I said, of course, because his rugby teammate was coming out as trans, and I was like, oh God, yeah, of course, come along. Then there's another lady whose child was non-binary and was sort of transitioning and sort of thinking in the future, and she came along and she said afterwards that she was so delighted that because as a mother worried about anything that a child is different because of where they're going to get bullied or the hard life, and she said it was so great, it really was life affirming for her that companies like ours were looking after people and making this a point that this is fine and be who you want, because then even though she wasn't a trans person in our business, she had a daughter who would go into business at some point and was worried what will their life be. So that really boosted, Amanda coming to talk really boosted her as well. So it's not just about your employees, it's about that whole extended network and the whole ESG piece into the community as well.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear, because I know, and I'm going to move on to clients actually, because otherwise we haven't got time, but I saw law firms have made quite a lot of noise about being supportive of LGBT, and you do sort of wonder, having been an ex-lawyer myself, whether that whether that's actually true. So it's good to hear these positive stories as well. It's good to hear, that the firm's been supportive, because I sometimes feel like there's a disparity between reality and perception. And so, it's good to hear. In terms of, I feel like when it comes to often it seems to be clients that are really pushing law firms when it comes to diversity, but I'm not really clear on, obviously they've been, some of the big tech companies, they've been very good at insisting when it comes to the breakdown of men and women, that there must be this ratio and this, but I'm not really clear, to be honest with you, on how far that goes in terms of how far they are pushing the envelope when it comes to LGBT. And I wondered if you could help me with that, whether perhaps clients ought to be doing more, because it doesn't seem that perhaps they're going far enough.
Yeah, I can give you a few thoughts on that. So for sure they are, the whole ESG and the whole diversity and inclusion piece is going way up the importance list at the moment. The last few years, we've seen a tremendous change. And there was news in the Lawyer, I think it was a British, BT as they would call themselves these days.
Yes,
I've said that on their panel, their legal panel, they will instantly give a space to the people that have got the highest diversity and inclusion scores, whatever they are and however they measure, I don't know. So there's someone that is actually really actioning that, in spirit, but certainly they're all, probably 5 years ago it was a nice to have. Now you have to, and not, not tokenism as, Luke referred to earlier on, but actual concrete. You need to be living and breathing it, not just we've ticked a few boxes on the Stonewall Equality Index that, how do your people feel and things. And that's why we're beginning more and more in our firm, certainly to pull, different people into these sort of things, just to make the point about it's not celebrating trans people one day a year. It's, what are you doing the whole year? So I don't know, Luke or Amanda, if this has touched you guys personally.
Well, from my perspective, most of the clients I deal with are multinational insurance companies, and they have their own equivalent of Spectrum as our group. So when I came out, I had 2 or 3 clients I dealt with on a regular basis, had done for 10, 15 years. People knew me on a personal level as well as a professional level, and I was a little bit nervous about how that would come across, but they're as clued up as we are, if not higher. One of my big insurer clients, they're probably way ahead of us. So in that respect, we as part of my transitioning, we spoke to their team, who spoke to their staff. So that was the fact that existed made the whole process of me coming into work on one day as someone else compared to how I was 3 days ago over the weekend seamless. And the fact that they were, I wouldn't call it an agenda, but they are absolutely at ease with trans people in their company and absolutely supportive, not just on a Pride Month, TDOV, etc., but all year. And one of my clients has ambassadors. So, and are out there selling their image. And this is, a multi-trillion-pound insurance company covering the whole globe. And to them, it's second nature. And I think we've got something to learn from them.
It's really good, because it's only when the client, in my experience, so that's when it makes a really big difference. Not only, but so that's when the clients put the firms under pressure. Then that's when things really start to change. Luke, we started to run out of time. I wanted to ask you one more thing, but did you have anything to add on that, Luke, in terms of the client point?
Not really. I mean, I'm not really involved in procurement, but I think in terms of getting a sense of a firm's culture, I always find it quite interesting if a firm is willing to sort of brag about its corporate social responsibility initiatives, but has nothing in terms of its D&I sort of credentials on its website, because it kind of begs the question, why would you not be proud of the fact that you're a Stonewall diversity champion, or the fact that that you support law care, whatever it might be. So that, I think, for me, the absence of that almost raises more questions than the presence of it answers. But yeah, that's always something that I kind of look for. And I'd sort of pleasantly surprised recently to see that there was a job listing posted by sort of a law firm that does quite niche LGBT plus sort of specific family law. And at the bottom of that, they specifically said that they welcomed kind of trans and BAME applicants, I think by virtue of that recognition of the fact that the sort of the trans community perhaps isn't, it's not that they're not well served by the business currently, but in recognition of the fact that culturally clients do kind of expect lawyers that they can relate to. And there is something to be said for that rapport where, you just know that your lawyer is going to get it. So I guess those are the real things to look for. Although to some extent, it's going to be limited by the amount of diversity within the talent pool. I mean, women in STEM is an ongoing kind of quandary. These are certainly things to look for, I guess.
Yeah, and actually speaking to people in advance of this meeting, and I was trying to find out, because obviously it's well known, and David, you and I have talked about this, how for people of colour these issues are magnified, and actually
sectionality, as we call it, yeah. Right,
and it's actually really, there's a very visible lack of diversity when it comes to that. But so I was going to ask you. Just last, and again, this comes from something that David and I touched on, which I thought would be worth us wrapping up on, which is this sort of that people almost come up with excuses as to why they can't talk about either whether it be trans or LGBT, and they say, there's all this terminology, right? It's all very confusing, all these abbreviations, and we were discussing that really. I think it's pretty much a way to just avoid talking about it full stop, and that actually really all you need to do is just come from a position of empathy, and that we were saying that you don't need to get caught up. And I just wondered if you could just conclude with your observations on that in terms of what you would advise people, and how we can get past this slightly ridiculous fixation on that side of things, which is just a distraction.
I mean, from my perspective, because it's been relatively recent for me, I've always said to everyone, you can ask me what you want, provided it's done respectfully, and it's done with a general interest or a general inquiry, or, I'll give you an example. My father, he's 85 years old this year, completely different generation. And it was always going to be the most difficult conversation I was ever going to have. Give him his due. He's gone out and researched things, but even then, he still says to me, "Look, he surreptitiously he'll drop something into a conversation, but he does it nicely." And I always say, if someone approaches me with a genuine look, I'm trying to learn, I'm trying to make sure that going forward. A lot of people have said you're the first trans person I've come across on a close relationship basis, and I've said to them, look, this is an ever increasing pool. I hate to say, there's a lot of us out there, and the way society opens up, and more of us will come out, and more of us will be happy to be who we are. So you've got to learn. But the fact that they've come to me and said, look, I want to learn. To me, that's brilliant. I've just gone, yeah, okay, let's have a sit down over a glass of wine, or, what's the questions that you need answering? I've always said there's never a line to be crossed until I turn around and say, no, you've crossed the line. But even when any question is perhaps a little bit uncomfortable, I'll explain to you why I'm not going to answer it. Give a reason. So at every stage, any interaction with me, they're always learning and gaining extra information. And as I said, I know I've probably said it a few times, it's all about education.
Yeah.
That's absolutely the key going forward.
Okay. Luke, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that I would say is that the trans community isn't a monolith by any means, which kind of is what Amanda's saying. She's clearly at the slightly more open book end of things in the same way that I am. But there'll be other people who see it very much as kind of, a private matter, something they don't want to talk about. And I think it's just recognizing, first of all, that, not everybody is going to be happy being approached with questions. So at least try and research it yourself first and ask yourself, would I ask any other colleague about this? If not, then maybe you shouldn't be asking this colleague. And I guess the other thing as well is in in terms of terminology, there are some sort of broadly accepted definitions out there. Like trans is broadly accepted as kind of covering people who don't identify as the gender they were assigned at birth. But for instance, there will be some people like me who technically are transsexuals, but that's a bit of an old school term these days that has fallen out of favor. So kind of if in doubt, then, there are organizations out there. The Law Society has got its own glossary that I forgot to mention. Stonewall has its own sort of glossary of terms. But if in doubt, there are plenty of charities and other organizations out there where you can kind of see the language that they're using and how it's broken down, and that will generally steer you, broadly in the right direction.
I think that's really good advice, that point about don't ask questions that you wouldn't ask. I think that's absolutely spot on. David, did you have any last observations? We're pretty much out of time.
I think I'd reflect that. I think, I would start as well, and not in a bad way, but I think if you come from, education and empathy, as Amanda said, learning, then fine. Just be a little bit careful. You are in the workplace and all the rest of it. And then even if you're at the pub afterwards, it's still seen, I'm a manager, I've got a large team, so you just have to be, if you're respectful and it's from an education perspective, then great, but sometimes, and I think it is only human nature to be inquisitive. I get it, people have now sort of mostly got the whole sexuality thing tick, and now every week there's another letter popping up, and I do get it, and human beings are about putting people in a box, this is a, fight or flight thing and all the rest of it, straight, gay, white, black, religious, not religious, everyone constantly compartmentalizes people, and I think we just have to get rid of that a little bit, and just everyone's human, one human family, that's it. Does it really matter, what people call themselves or what they want to be? As long as it doesn't hurt you and I, who cares? Treat them with respect.
Well, that seems like an amazing point to end it on. And just to say thank you so much, David, Amanda, Luke. I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with me today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Good to see you.